Hello, I'm Tracy Nicholas, and welcome to Folkloring. I am a passionate folklore practitioner, and to me, folkloring is more than just a podcast. It's my commitment to help you connect with your roots and awaken the wisdom within you.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode, which is about harvest folklore. But before I start, the ways that I've been folkloring lately are it's autumn here for me now while I'm recording this, and so I've been getting a lot of the second harvest of all of my herbs. So I've been tying up rosemary to dry. I've made a bunch of sage and lavender smudge sticks. So that's always fun. I love doing that in the fall. And also, though, coming up in a couple of days, I am going to be going to a Mabon ritual with some really great people that I met not too long ago. And so that'll be nice to actually stop and have just dedicated, set aside time for ritual, because that's really hard for me to find a lot of times. So anyway, harvest folklore. Now, when we think about the harvest, like I said, it's autumn here, so we think a lot about harvest at this time of year. But really, harvest goes for a really long time, right? For a lot of people, like for me, I start harvesting berries in early to mid-June. I have a mulberry tree, and so I love harvesting those. Strawberries, where I live, come in around June. And you would have, if you're talking about a more rural kind of farming look, the first cut of hay usually starts in mid-June. And the harvest will go all the way through December in lots of places, with the last crops of like apples and root crops and that sort of thing. And so when we think about what we harvest, of course we think grains and fruit and vegetables, but there's also a lot of other things that people harvest, such as meat. There's a time of year where people are really putting up meat. Wool is gathered during June and July in a lot of places. There's the picking of hops. Back in early Britain, when they would go out and gather gorse and bracken for fuel and for thatching material, that was done in the fall. And even shellfish harvest on the east coast of the U.S. is part of what all of the harvesting is. Now, some of the deities that are associated with the harvest. I'm going to start with Mabon, who is the Celtic god of life, death, and resurrection, and also the harvest. Then we have Dionysus, who is the autumnal god of wine and ecstatic trance, so wine and intoxication, and not specifically a harvest god, but associated with the grapes ripening and wine being made in the fall in ancient times. And Dionysus is a very liminal deity and manifests in trance-like states such as ecstatic dance, obviously intoxication, and also shamanic journeys. Then we have Lu, who is the Celtic god of the harvest, and also the god of the sun. The name means bright shining one, and his energy is linked to the sun. And so one of the things that you can do to connect to Lu is meditating and invoking his presence while sunbathing. That's a particularly powerful way to connect. And Lu had a lot of skills, including war and also craftsmanship, and considered to be an ancestor to some of the old Irish families, and according to the Irish mythos. He is a personification of grain and must die in the harvest in order for us to live. So I thought that was interesting. Then there's Osiris, who is the Egyptian autumn god of death and the harvest. Now, Osiris is often depicted with green skin because of his connection to the earth. And obviously, we see the symbolism of the changing of the seasons and the dying off of the earth. And that's supposed to be linked to the Osiris's story of death and rebirth, which is obviously what happens year to year. And also, this Egyptian god is believed to be the first mummy of Egyptian antiquity, when his wife Isis collected the pieces of his body and wrapped them up to bring him back to life. Then we have the Norse trickster god Loki, and was associated with the harvest moon, which is the first full moon after the first frost of the winter seasons. Now, of course, we have a scheduled moon that is either in September or October that is our harvest moon, so it's a little different now. And the harvest moon is seen to be one of the most powerful moons of the year, which would make sense, it being linked to Loki, since there's so much lore around how crazy people get in a full moon. And if this is a particularly powerful one, that connection to Loki does make a lot of sense. And then we have Demeter, who's the Greek goddess of the harvest. Now, in Norse mythology, the goddess Freya was connected to the harvest moon, and she presides over fertility, love, and abundance. And lots of cultures have had myth and folklore around the harvest moon. And the harvest moon was important because before the widespread use of artificial lighting, the bright light of a full moon played a crucial role for farmers because they could continue on under the full moon, and they would have enough light to keep harvesting and keep going with other activities. And so often the time around the harvest moon marked a time of festivals. And, there's a lot of gratitude and a lot of feasting. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a bit. But also, the harvest moon, and this is something I remember from my childhood, it was an orange moon. And what I was told at the time was that it was from all of the harvesting going on and the dust being kicked up from those activities. And I distinctly remember the orange moon. And then a couple of years back, I was driving one evening, and there was this big, bright orange moon in July. And I thought, what could be going on with that? I've never seen, and in my mind, it was a harvest moon. I've never seen that in July. And then I found out it was because of the wildfires that were happening in California, and the wind had been bringing it here. And so that ash in the air turned the moon orange. So there is something to that. Now, interesting side note, in some European folklore, the harvest moon was linked to werewolves and other supernatural occurrences, specifically the harvest moon. And so there's lots of stories about shapeshifters and magical beings taking advantage of the harvest moon energy. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are harvest festivals, and there's lots of them, and the traditions around them are very local, so I'm going to try and touch on some of the stuff that is common between these different festivals. And I'm going to start with Lunasa and Mabon. And those are Celtic harvest festivals, or they were Celtic harvest festivals, that are still practiced by a lot of modern pagans. And these festivals marked the beginning of the harvest season, the transition from summer to autumn, and they often featured bonfires, music, dancing, offerings to deities that are associated with fertility and the harvest. And certainly lots of European harvest celebrations featured feasting and partying and abundant harvest foods, music, dancing. And in some European cultures, the moon was believed to possess magical powers. And so rituals were performed under the harvest moon, and they were thought to bring good luck and different blessings. Now, if we look to Japan, there is the Tsukimi Festival, and that is the full moon viewing festival. And it always coincides with the harvest moon. And families gather together to admire the moon's beauty and express gratitude for the autumn harvest. And they offer rice dumplings and other seasonal foods to the moon as a symbol of thanks and also to receive blessings for a bountiful future. Now, in the Pueblo peoples, and there are lots of different sovereign nations that fall under Pueblo people, and they have harvest dances, and obviously they differ from the different tribes, but they had traditional harvest dances during the full moon of September, and that was to honor the agricultural cycles, to pay homage to the spirits that they believed guide the growth of crops, and it involved music and dance and prayers for a successful harvest. Now, in Britain, there are harvest festival customs going back to pre-Roman times in ancient Britain. And these harvest festivals are known as the Harvest Festival. And they typically happen on the Sunday closest to the harvest moon, which there is considered to be the full moon closest to the autumnal equinox, and so can appear up to 2 weeks before or after the equinox. And so in considering that, the Harvest Festival can actually take place on a Sunday within a 6-week period, making it a very variable date for that celebration. And it can definitely be traced back to the centuries immediately following the Roman invasion of Britain, though it's probably from long before then, but there aren't really records to show that. Now, following the Roman occupation and throughout the Saxon and Norman periods, the Harvest Festival was one of giving thanks through prayer and sacrifice. And everyone who produced food, they would bring food to a parish feast, with some to be distributed for everyone to eat together and the rest to be donated to the less fortunate. And from the very last sheaf of corn or wheat at this festival, they would make a dolly. And it was a small effigy that took a place of pride at the table during the Harvest Festival and then would be kept until the next seeds were sown the following spring. And I'm going to talk more about corn dollies and other kinds of different things that are made from the corn a little bit later. From the Middle Ages to the Victorian era, this harvest festival was colloquially known as the Horky or the Hokey, and in some places they still do refer to it like that. Now, it again would involve drinking and merriment and a feast, and it would typically take place in a barn or the town square. And the last harvest from the fields would be brought in by a horse and cart decorated with garlands of flowers and ribbons, and the church bells would be rung. And an individual would dress as Harvest and dance around with a scythe, followed by other reapers carrying sickles. Now, it's definitely possible that this is where the traditional guise of death came from, particularly because the Harvest Festival and Samhain can fall so close to one another. And foods would include plum cakes, seeded breads, along with meat, often from birds. And they believe that this harvest supper tradition was brought over to America, and it's what we now know as Thanksgiving. Now, In 1843, in Cornwall, there was a Reverend, Robert Hawker, and he invited his parishioners into the church for harvest supper. And this idea caught on. And so throughout the Victorian era, the town gathering and drinking was replaced with harvest-based hymns and church observations along with this meal, which does not sound like a great trade-off at all. And Harvest Festival is still noted in the Christian calendar. But now it's also popular in British schools, where children bring canned and tin goods to be donated to the less fortunate. And often nowadays they're given to food banks. Once the main harvest and the harvest supper was over, then came the time for the women to begin gleaning. And gleaning was scouring the fields for leftover ears of corn, which they could then claim and keep for themselves. In a lot of places, they elected a harvest queen to oversee the gleaning, whose role was to ensure that everyone got their fair share. And they did this by regulating the start and finish of work, either by ringing a handbell or giving the word when the church bells rang. And the harvest queen also had the right to initiate any newcomers to the gleaning field by tapping the soles of their boots with a stone. Another feasting celebration that is associated with the harvest is Michaelmas, and that's celebrated on September 29th and also known as the Feast of St. Michael within the Catholic Church. And it's associated with the harvest because of its proximity to the autumn equinox, and it includes some older harvest customs, such as the weaving of corn dolls from the last sheaves of grain. And a corn doll was crafted by early societies to honor the grain fields, and that custom continued into the Michaelmas celebrations of the early Middle period. And it was understood then that the grain fields had spirits, and the corn doll represented the spirit for those rows and sheaves of grain. And a doll or a corn mother was created often from the final sheaf, and it was treated with reverence and honor. And that doll provided a place for the spirit of the grain or the corn to reside until the next harvest season rolled around. So the more respect that you placed on the doll, the more likely that the spirits of the fields would bless you with abundance the next year. Michaelmas was considered the official beginning of winter, and it was also the time in which winter grains were sown, like wheat and rye, for harvesting the following year. Now, if you look at the symbolism, because Michaelmas was so close to the equinox, and because it's a day to honor St. Michael's accomplishments, which included the slaying of a fierce dragon, it's often associated with having courage in moving into the darker, more dangerous half of the year. Michael was also associated with sailors. He was the patron saint of sailors. And so in some seafaring areas, this day is also celebrated with the baking of a special cake from the grains of the final harvest. In talking about the equinox, we often hear about the solstices, the equinox, the cross-quarter days. Well, the term quarter days is derived from a system in the British Isles, which certain days of the year, and this was 4 times a year, near the solstices and the equinoxes, they were marked as time to collect rent, to hire new servants, to resolve legal matters. And in England and Wales, the original quarter days were Lady Day, Midsummer, Michaelmas, and Christmas. And these obviously corresponded with Ostara, Litha, Mabon, and Yule. And this system of quarters was used as early as the Middle Ages. So a little bit of folklore around Michaelmas. It was custom that originated in the Victorian area that any trees planted on this day would grow and flourish especially well. Now, in Ireland, there's a custom that if you eat a goose on this day, you have an extra lucky remainder of the year. And also, if the goose's bones are brown after you roast them, that means winter will be mild. But if they end up being white, you're in for a harsh and cold winter ahead. Now, it's also said that if you gather blackberries after Michaelmas, they'll be unfit for human consumption, because that's the day the devil either spits or stomps on them. And it kind of makes sense, because by that point in the year, they're pretty much done, and they wouldn't be good to eat anyway. Interestingly, while cutting the last sheaf of grain can be seen as bad luck in some British Isle legend, in Eastern European tradition, it's seen as good luck. And especially if it's accompanied by an elder petitional prayer, so widows and orphans, rich and poor, everybody would be blessed with a plentiful harvest. And field workers would decorate this last sheaf with flowers and ribbons, and members of the landlord's family would carry it home with bread and salt in a joyful procession, and there would be singing of ritual harvest songs and dancing. And workers would also fashion colorful wreaths to be worn by unmarried youth. And the host, the landowner, would place the sheaf on a peg in a ritual corner of the house, which would hold icons and a censer and candles. And a harvest dinner would usually follow, and in some traditions, this was known as the grandfather sheaf, and it remained in that sacred niche in the house until Christmas Eve. And at that time, on Christmas Eve, some grain was taken and used to make a traditional cereal dessert, while other kernels were ritually scattered outside for the fertility of the fields and blessings for the household. Now, they might also make an effigy of a Baba Yaga fashioned from straw that they had at the end. And it's kind of interesting because I love Baba Yaga and how ambiguous she is. So in the agrarian folklore in Eastern Europe, she was seen both as a guardian of crops and also as a witch who could withhold humanity's bounty from the earth. So she could either give it or take it away. And so there is this old woman who existed, in that terrible twilight between nature and culture. And, she was unfettered in the borderlands, separating the field and the forest. So parents would warn their children not to wander through the countryside or trample on any crops, or they might be taken by Baba Yaga, which, is probably one of those convenient fictions that comes about to prevent people from wandering around and damaging the grain. There were lots of what were considered field spirits in Eastern European traditions. For example, in Russia, there were these field spirits that were misshapen, clumsy beings, and they tended to appear at midday, and they would be the color of that area's soil with hair made out of wild grass from the area. And their appearance usually foreshadowed bad luck. And in German folklore, there were field spirits called Feldgeister, and some were shaped as animals, some were in human forms. There are lots and lots and lots of these. The ones as animals like cats, bears, donkeys, rabbits, pigs, sheep, foxes, mice. It just goes on and on. And they would leave the last grain heads and tree fruit out as a sacrifice for these agricultural spirits. And during the harvest season, the Feldgeister would flee into the woods to escape, the grains being cut down. And in the very last corn stalk, the corn spirit would become trapped and either it would be, killed if you cut the grain head and threshed the corn, or they would bring it to the village in, again, a ceremonial manner as a corn doll, so they could once again save that spirit. So that's a theme that you see all over the place. That being said, in the German tradition, some of the human-shaped field spirits, there were two. There was one called the Kornkind, which is the corn child, which I love the fact that they had actual children of the corn, or the Ahrenkind, which is the grain head child. And those are spirits that are identified with the fruit of the field, and they're considered to be born by actually harvesting them. So a different approach to that. Now, focusing back on Britain, because no one wants to kill the harvest spirit, they had a ritual called either crying the neck, crying the mare, or cutting the neck. And the neck is a big handful of the last sheaf of corn. And in Devon and Cornwall, they had a ritual where the harvester or cutter cuts it, holds it up, and says, "I have 'em, I have 'em, I have 'em." And then the rest of the people cry out, "What have ye, what have ye, what have ye?" And he replies, "A neck, a neck, a neck." And the neck is bound with ribbons, and then that's what they keep for the year. And it was definitely a considerable ceremony. And it, like a lot of accounts, because people did see this as, they didn't want to anger the spirits, they would talk about the reapers binding that last sheaf and then standing clear of it while they took turns throwing their sickles from a safe distance until it finally cut down and fell over. And in Herefordshire, there was the same kind of thing. They would leave a small patch of corn standing, and they would tie it into 4 bunches, and it was the 4 legs of a mare, and they were tied at the top. And then they would try and cut off the ears of corn by standing at a certain distance and throwing their sickles at the mare and holding them by the point to actually throw them. And in some places, the men even stood with their backs to the mare, but this would require a lot of skill in throwing that sickle. And sometimes it took hours to do this. And the man who succeeded on that last cut would sit at one end of the table opposite the owner, the landowner, at the harvest supper in a place of honor. And for that last sheaf, then it was, very carefully plated in a variety of different ways. And I'm going to talk about that in a bit. But it was kept up in the main household until the next harvest. In the Highlands, it was even considered important that the right person should actually cut the neck. And in Rannoch, it was the youngest person in the harvest field, and it didn't matter if it was a boy or girl, while in Strathay, the farmer himself would have to cut it. And there it was generally woven into a doll, which might be plowed back into the land when plowing began again in the spring, or it might be fed to the horses when the first load of the next year's harvest was brought into the barn. Now, when they were weaving this maiden form, if the harvest had been a good one, the maiden was woven into a youthful form. But if it was a disappointing harvest, then the maid was woven into the form of a hag. Although I don't know how you could differentiate between a maiden form made out of corn and a hag, but they did dress the hag as an old woman, so maybe that's how they did it. Now, on to looking a little bit deeper at these grain dollies and corn dollies. Now, in a lot of cases, these were a figure of either a person or an animal. And it was a harvest custom because that's when the straw or the corn was available. And we can see examples that go back to 7th century Flanders, and in Germany there's lots of records of corn dollies being produced in ancient times. And we talked about this before, that it's for the spirit of the corn or the spirit of the harvest to keep them safe until the next year. And oftentimes they would take those corn dolls and put it on the pew of a church, in the last pew of the church. And when it wasn't put like in, the landowner's home or something like that. Now, this was frowned upon by the clergy, but it was something that rural people did, and so they didn't really stop them from doing it. And that tradition still goes on to this day in some places. Now, oftentimes these were figures, but they weren't always. And a lot of times they were made into different designs, various knots, spirals, a horseshoe, a heart, and those were considered favors, or sometimes they're called countrymen's favors. And they were made by a young man to give to his beloved. And again, there were spirals, horseshoe, but the ones that the young men would give often had a heart shape or a circle tied with ribbon to symbolize eternity and obviously symbolize love. So when I started this episode, I was talking about different kinds of harvests, and I focused a lot on corn and wheat because they're very important, right? I do want to talk about a couple of other different kinds of harvest and the folklore that goes with them. And the first one, looking back to Britain, is the blood harvest. And in the days either leading up to Samhain or on what was known as Old Winter's Day, which is October 11th, those were considered the right time for killing surplus livestock before the winter came on. And a lot of rural people kept a pig, which was fed during the summer on waste and slops, and in the autumn on gleaned grain and other refuse from the harvest. So by November, not only was the pig its fattest, but the months after that, it would have seen, an increasing shortage of food for the pig. Now, in Wiltshire, it was strongly believed that pigs had to be killed on a waxing moon or the meat would go bad. Now, as far as sheep, there were, again in Wiltshire, sheep fairs. And that would have to do with shearing. And in Wiltshire, the sheep were referred to as the golden hoof, and shepherds were regarded as kind of the aristocracy of farm workers. In Devon, farmers would drive their sheep to communal shearings in July, where they would combine all their resources and get the work done. And so those communal shearings became a time for celebrations, social activities, and the evenings were used for feasting, for music, for dancing, that kind of thing. And in August, they would hold sheep fairs. And these were held pretty much anywhere where sheep formed an important part of the economy. And so, for example, in Wiltshire, they were held in Marlborough, Bradford-on-Avon, and Wilton. And to give you an idea of the scale of these events, that in Wilton alone, in the 1860s, during a single year's fair, somewhere between 90,000 and 100,000 sheep were sold. And at the Wheat Sheaf Inn at Wilton, there was an annual competition that was held by the shepherds to elect one of their number to be the king of shepherds for the year. Now, I couldn't find any idea of what the responsibilities of the king of shepherds would be, but surely it was a high honor. Hops were also important to many communities as far as their seasonal employment, as far as the economy goes. And hop picking would start in the middle of August and continue till at least mid-September. Now, an interesting custom that I found, which I think is kind of hilarious, is called cribbing. And it was pretty widely observed by these seasonal laborers, although it seems that the farmers weren't too excited about it. So new seasonal workers, male seasonal workers that were doing this for the first time, they would be seized by women and thrown into these cribs, which were basically wooden frames, and they had sacking put in them in order to catch the hops that were thrown into these frames. Now, the new worker would be then covered in hops, and he would only be released when he had kissed all the women present and given them money for a drink. Now, at the end of the season, unmarried women could be expected to be picked up by the men and dumped into the cribs. And sometimes the women would retaliate by ganging up on the men and throwing them into a crib, and occasionally throwing a woman on top of him, covering them both with hops. And this obviously had overt sexual overtones. And it's funny because the women take the lead. It might be that this sort of casual workforce that comes together for a bit and then disperses again, and it was sort of urban and rural workers meeting up for a few weeks out of the year, that sort of gender reversal of roles was allowed because the women had more freedom in this sort of temporary community than they would otherwise have. Now, there was also a custom to choose a king and queen of the hop pickers, and the head hop picker would be dressed up and bedecked with ribbons and different sprays of hops, and he would walk in front of the last load of hops from the hop yard, and behind this last load came the two hop pickers who were chosen to be the king and queen. The woman would wear male clothing, and the man was wearing a women's dress. Now, it doesn't seem like there was any particular method for choosing the king and queen, but their main duties seem to have been to just make fun of everybody else. Honestly, I think I would be spectacular at that, and I just want to find out how I can get that job. Okay. So, a lot about harvesting. It's a huge topic, which, it must be obvious to anyone who's listened by now that I love massive topics. So it was an overview, and there's a lot more. If you want to learn more about harvest festivals and all things harvest, it's a great time of year to do it if you're listening around the time where I've recorded this. So let's look at a little bit of folkloring. Now, if you're fortunate enough to be in a place that has a harvest feast, of course you can attend that. If you're not, you can create one for yourself and your friends and your neighbors, either a harvest feast or a harvest picnic. Now, obviously, you can make corn dollies, and there's lots of tutorials online for that. So, that sort of modern online way of learning from our elders, it's really easy to find how to fashion those. And I've done it, and it's a lot of fun. Now, if you're a gardener, obviously this is the time where you're gathering up. If you're in the Northern Hemisphere, you're gathering what will soon be the last of the harvest for your garden. If you're not a gardener, obviously the farmer's market has tons of great root veggies and apples and lots of end of the season kind of foods available. Now, I also think that if you are going to get some of the food that is ripening in your area, that it's always nice to be able to cook seasonally. So whatever is coming up around you, this is the time of year where we start to settle in and have those good stews and soups with root veggies. Although I can't really say that today because it was about 90 degrees, so still very much a summer vibe going on where I am. Now, I spoke earlier about connecting with a harvest deity by meditating or focusing on that deity in the sun, or you can just focus yourself on different deities that you'd like to connect with in your meditation, in your ritual. Also, a lot of people this is a great time of year for canning, preserving, possibly dehydrating stuff. So you have that for, your winter stores, even though that's not as necessary for us anymore. It's still a great way to connect to what's going on in the world around you. Thank you for being here with me and listening. I wish you abundance and bounty. And if you have any comments or questions, feel free to send them along. Thanks, everyone.
As always, thanks for listening to Folkloring. If you liked what you heard, please consider leaving a rating and review. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. If you have any questions or comments or would like to suggest a topic for a future episode, please email us at folkloringpod@gmail.com or message us on Facebook or Instagram. Other places you can find me are at the Folklore Podcast as the theater, film, and storytellers correspondent, or creating folklore-inspired games at madmenandheroes.com. Stay curious, stay connected, and keep the traditions alive. And I hope that wherever you are, folklore is making your life more magical.